For anyone who likes video games, imagining what the future might hold has always been part of the fun. Back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, a lot of new releases felt like a revolution. Graphics, gameplay, the whole experience just kept evolving. It felt like gaming was reaching new heights, with ambitious ideas and endless possibilities pushing it forward. But have you ever felt that despite all the extra teraflops of processing power, modern games are becoming somewhat less impressive? But here's the thing, at a certain point, adding more and more polygons just doesn't cut it anymore. You eventually start to get diminishing returns. Of course, graphics aren't just about polygons. Other factors like rendering, lighting, particle effects, and physics systems all play a role in creating a more impressive experience. But let's be real, games have always been about more than just how they look. Thankfully, creativity and innovation have found ways to shine in other areas. The rise of the internet brought online multiplayer and the ability to update games post-launch. Bigger storage and faster processors paved the way for massive open worlds and increasingly complex games. And as budgets grew, so did the push to make games feel more cinematic. But in recent years, with some notable exceptions, it feels like games have become bigger and more complex without necessarily becoming better. They're not always more enjoyable or even more impressive than the games that came before them. So what's going on? In this video, we'll break down a few key areas where these diminishing returns are most apparent and look at some examples that prove that sometimes less really is more. While more polygons lead to increasingly subtle improvements, the push for better graphics never stops, and visuals are the easiest way to sell us on new hardware. In recent years, two buzzwords dominated discussions about consoles and GPU upgrades: ray tracing and higher resolutions. During the previous console generation with the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, 4K gaming was the big promise. Now, with the PS5 and Xbox Series X, the focus has shifted to ray tracing and how it's supposed to revolutionize game visuals. But here's the catch. This obsession with graphical fidelity often leads to the same outcome, a noticeable drop in performance, with many games capped at 30 frames per second. If I had written this a few months ago, I would have guessed that most players, when given the option, preferred smoother gameplay over higher resolution or ray tracing. And it turns out that's actually the case. During the PS5 Pro review, Sony shared that roughly 3/4 of players opt for performance mode over graphical fidelity. And resolution might become a non-issue thanks to things like DLSS, FSR, and frame generation. But for ray tracing, for me, it's just not worth the trade-off in performance or price, and it often doesn't even look all that impressive in comparison, at least so far. And then there's the issue of optimization. Of course, demanding games have always existed, especially on PC. But back in the day, games like Doom 3, Half-Life 2, and Crysis pushed the boundaries so far that upgrading your hardware felt justified. By comparison, some of today's demanding games, like Immortals of Aveum, Space Marine 2, or the Silent Hill 2 remake, might look good, but they don't exactly make you want to rush out and buy a new GPU or a PS5 Pro. They also run on Unreal Engine 5, which is another issue altogether. It's not just about graphics though. The way games are sold, updated, and monetized has also evolved, and not always for the better. What once seemed like a great idea, online updates and additional content for our favorite games, has become a breeding ground for questionable practices. With the ability to patch games post-launch, it's almost expected that games will launch unfinished. In many cases, it feels like if you buy a game on launch, you are essentially paying to be a beta tester, downloading day one patches and endless updates just to get a playable experience. And we've seen developers try to justify subpar launches with excuses like 30 frames per second is an artistic choice, only to release a 60 FPS mode a few months later. And then there's DLC. Once intended as meaningful expansions packed with hours of new content, DLCs today often feel like overpriced cosmetic items, or worse, parts of the game that were deliberately cut from the base version to be sold separately. Fighting games are a prime example. Imagine a game launching with 30 characters while another 20 are locked behind DLC packs. And publishers will often split these into small bundles to squeeze even more profit out of the fans. But the real low point comes in the form of loot boxes. It's gambling disguised as a game mechanic, preying on our desire for rare items and that addictive winner's rush. And let's not forget that many of these games are aimed at younger players, who are especially vulnerable to these predatory practices. The merging of gaming and gambling is a serious problem. It's so bad that governments worldwide, including the European Union, are stepping in to regulate or at least demand more transparency around loot boxes. With executives obsessed with quarterly profits and development costs skyrocketing, games are becoming less about fun and more about squeezing every last dollar out of players through microtransactions, updates, and those ever-present loot boxes. But the internet didn't just bring us online gaming and DLCs, it also brought us digital storefronts. On PC, this happened early on and now it's the norm. But PCs are a different beast. with their mods, emulators, and let's face it, piracy. Plus, supporting thousands of hardware configurations is a challenge in itself. Consoles, on the other hand, are standardized. Millions of identical units, perfect for game preservation. Or at least they were until digital distribution took over. We're now seeing a clear push towards all digital consoles. Early in this generation, most systems still included disk drives, and the upcoming Switch 2 will likely continue to use its game cards. But recent releases like the PS5 Slim, PS5 Pro, and the all-digital Xbox Series X and S have either removed disk drives entirely or made them optional. All signs suggest that the PS6 and the next Xbox will continue this trend. This shift is a serious change to how we access games. It's killing off the used game market, which was a great way to get games on a budget. And it's not just about price. Relying on servers raises serious questions about game preservation. For instance, what happens when those servers go down? Publishers now have more control than ever, especially with games that require a constant connection. Even Steam now tells you that you're buying a license, not the game itself. With physical media fading away, preserving gaming history is becoming a real concern. Digital downloads are convenient, sure, but the trade-offs are huge. And so far, the industry has done little to address this or offer meaningful alternatives. Even game development used to be a different beast. Small teams, shorter timelines, a game could be made in just a few months or a couple of years. But now, projects involve hundreds of people, take half a decade of development, and come with skyrocketing production and marketing costs. With those kinds of financial stakes, companies need to see a big return just to break even. As a result, many studios have grown increasingly risk-averse. Games take so long to make that by the time they're released, they can feel outdated. Trends change, players move on, and the mechanics and art direction used at the start of the project might feel obsolete by the end. It's no wonder companies play it safe with sequels, remakes, and established franchises. There's a built-in audience and the risk of failure is lower. But it also means we get fewer original ideas and less innovation. And then there's the design by committee approach, cramming in every feature imaginable. Skill trees, RPG mechanics, loot boxes, vehicles, stealth systems, and more. But does all that added complexity actually makes games more fun? More often than not, the answer is a clear no. Instead, it leads to bloated, unfocused experiences. So let's put it together. Rising costs, longer development times, the pressure to squeeze every last dollar out of players. It's no wonder we're seeing less variety in games these days. Companies are playing it safe, sticking to familiar formulas instead of taking risks. The result is a flood of sequels, remakes, and remasters. Games that almost blur together, losing their unique identity in the process. Originality and innovation seem to be risky moves in today's market. And it's not just about outright flops like Concord. Even underperforming games can result in a bad outcome for the studio. We've seen record layoffs in 2023 and 2024, and even a giant company like Ubisoft is rumored to be looking for a buyer. By now you might be thinking, that's it then, gaming is doomed, there is no going back, and they don't make games like they used to. But hold on, if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that's not how I end things. And if you're not subscribed yet, well, that's your cue to hit that button. There are still plenty of incredibly fun games being released, or receiving updates and new content. And there are success stories that shows us a different path forward. There's still room for creativity, innovation, and most importantly, fun. One of the best examples of modern gaming success, both in terms of units sold and brand recognition, is Nintendo. Nintendo realized with the Wii that it wasn't about raw power or fancy graphics. It was about nostalgia, consistent releases, creative risks, and most importantly, making games that are just plain fun. The Switch doubled down on this strategy, and now it's on track to be the best-selling console ever. Even without ray tracing, 4K graphics, or even some established games or franchises like GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, Call of Duty, Madden, or Destiny. So what's their secret? Well, for starters, they aren't afraid to be different. A lot of people thought that the Wii's motion controls were a gimmick, but by the end of that generation, both the Xbox and PlayStation had their own versions of it. And then, what if instead of having a portable and a home console, they combined it on a hybrid system? And here it is, dominating the market. They trust their instincts, take risks, and consistently deliver. And then there's the polish. You don't expect performance issues from Nintendo games. Even without the bells and whistles of high-performing CPUs and SSDs, they feel smooth, responsive, and packed with charm. They prioritize player experience above all else. Instead of chasing trends or cramming in every possible feature, they focus on solid gameplay and fun. That is a perfect example of less is more. Nintendo proves you don't need hyper-realistic graphics or endless microtransactions to create something truly special and profitable. Sometimes, all you need is a great idea that is well executed. But Nintendo isn't alone. The indie scene is thriving, and there are also other gaming studios coming out with great games. Take From Software for example. They consistently deliver complete, well-crafted games that push the boundaries of their game design. Even their DLCs get praised, proving that expansions can add real value to a game. Let's not forget Baldur's Gate 3, a masterpiece of RPG design from Larian Studios. There's also Hi-Fi Rush, a creative and different game that sadly suffered from all the mismanagement going around Xbox. And even Space Marine 2, despite its performance issues, feels like a great throwback to the good old days of Gears of War. Now, indie developers don't have to answer shareholders or marketing teams. They're driven to create something unique and meaningful to stand out. And indie games are the ultimate example of less is more. From the Indie Game of the Year card game made by a single person, to gems like Factorio, Animal Well, Broforce, Cuphead, and Sea of Stars, the list goes on and on. These games prove that smaller budgets and leaner teams can still create great experiences. They focus on innovative mechanics, engaging stories, and unique art styles. Even Sony had a moment of clarity this year, releasing a game that perfectly captured the charm of PlayStation's 90s and early 2000s era. With Astrobot, they earned the well-deserved Game of the Year award. It was one of the most enjoyable games I've played in years, and I hope it proves to PlayStation that not every exclusive needs to be a third-person story-driven game. Sometimes a focused, charming platformer is all it takes. So what can we learn from Nintendo and independent games? Sometimes less truly is more. When AAA games are bloated with features, riddled with microtransactions, and driven by risk aversion instead of innovation, it's refreshing to see developers who prioritize creativity, player experience, and above all, fun. Maybe it's time for the big studios to take a step back, to remember why they got into this industry in the first place, to focus on making games that are not just bigger and flashier, but truly better. Games that respect our time, give us the right amount of challenge, and tell great stories. Because in the end, that's what truly matters. This brings us to an important question. What would drive studios to take a different path? The answer lies in our behavior as players and consumers. Stop pre-ordering games. Support indie developers. Reward studios that take risks and try new things. We can't let games like Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown flop and then complain that Ubisoft doesn't try new things. We need to vote with our wallets. Most importantly, stop supporting games that disrespect your time and treat you like a walking ATM. And maybe for today's kids and teenagers, this is the golden age of gaming. One day they'll look back on the time they spent on Valorant, Fall Guys, and Fortnite with the same fondness we have for the games of our time. But for those of us who've been around for a while, it's hard to shake the feeling that something's missing. Games used to feel more complete somehow. They weren't always pushing DLC and microtransactions, and they often took more creative risks. Despite all the technological leaps, the returns aren't what they're cracked up to be. This doesn't mean gaming is dying, far from it, but it might be time for a shift in perspective. Maybe it's time to take inspiration from Nintendo, from indie developers, from those amazing AA games that prove less can truly be more. Great games don't need to squeeze every penny out of players to be profitable. When AAA games become so bloated and expensive that any misstep could bankrupt a studio, something is wrong. With ever-growing backlogs and data showing that we spend more time playing older games, maybe it's time to prioritize creativity and innovation over highly demanding graphics, huge open worlds, and massive budgets. Perhaps the future lies with indies, with well-executed live service games, with Nintendo's unique approach, and studios like Larian and From Software. Or maybe we'll see a resurgence of those creativity, risk-taking AA projects. Whatever the future holds, I'm pretty sure that one way or another, we're going to have great games to play. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.